an article from American history. 40 acres and a mule. After the Civil War, 4 million former slaves had their freedom, but not much else. What could be done to help them on their feet? Freedom. When the Civil War ended in 1865, William Matthews and the other slaves on his master's plantation heard the good news. After a lifetime of bondage, they were finally free. But there was little time for celebration. The plantation's mistress, Mary Adams, gathered the ex-slaves together. She bitterly predicted that they would be back working for her in 10 years. Then she banished them from their plantation. Many of the South's 4 million freed slaves suddenly had no place to live and no way to support themselves. No money, no nothing, Matthews remembered. Just run loose without nothing. The North had won the war. The Union was preserved, but the South lay in ruins. And now the U.S. government faced a huge problem. How could the South cities, factories, and railroads be rebuilt and its rebellious states allowed to rejoin the Union? This problem would consume the nation during the 12-year period known as the Reconstruction. Words to know. Freed man, an individual freed from slavery. Reconstruction. 1865 to 1877, the years after the Civil War, when the United States government worked to rebuild and reorganize the southern states that had seceded from the Union. Getting former slaves on their feet would be a big part of the job. To do this, Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, freed men and abandoned lands. Better known as the Freedmen's Bureau, its main mission, or objective, was to help former slaves. The sick and the poor. Bureau agents set up offices across the South. They encountered huge obstacles, including the hostility of many Southern whites. One bureau agent in Lexington, Virginia, was assaulted on the streets, and gangs gathered outside his office at night, daring him to come out. To make matters worse, Congress hadn't given the Bureau enough funding. In some places, a single agent was responsible for as many as 40,000 former slaves. An agent might go to work in the morning to find 500 people lined up waiting for help. Some needed emergency supplies. Others claimed that their new employers, many of them former slaveholders, were treating them unfairly or had physically abused them. The Bureau's most urgent task was helping the hungry and the sick. In the first 15 months following the war, agents handed out 13 million rations, each with enough corn, flour, and sugar to feed one person for a week. Words to know. Ration. A fixed amount of food and/or necessary materials given to each person, especially in times of scarcity. The Bureau also set up hospitals to treat the former slaves, but the assistance did not last. Once the hospitals were established, the Bureau turned over control to local officials. Southern white doctors often refused to treat Black people. Give us our own land. Near the end of the war, many slave owners had fled, and the Union Army seized their lands. Union General William Tecumseh Sherman tried to give some of this land to former slaves. In January 1865, he issued a order promising them 40-acre homesteads. Later, he said the Army might also loan each new landowner a mule which will work the land, giving rise to popular saying, 40 acres, and a mule. But in the summer and fall of 1865, President Andrew Johnson forgave the most former Confederates and gave back their property. The Freedmen's Bureau had ordered 40,000 angry freed people off the land they had been given. "Give us our own land and we'll take care of ourselves," said one ex-slave from Mississippi. "But without land, the old masters can hire us to serve as they please." Most former slaves had to go back to work on the plantation of former slave owners, as Mary Adams had predicted. For farming the land, they were paid $9 to $15 a month, or 1/4 to 1/2 of a crop. Some workers had to sign contracts that kept them in conditions much like slavery. They were fined for bad language or disobedience and were not allowed to leave the plantation without permission. Education makes a man free. Although the Freedmen's Bureau failed at many of its tasks, its agents understood what education meant to a former slave. Freedman Charles Whiteside, for instance, remembered one thing his former master had told him. "If you lives to be 100, you'll still be a slave, because you got no education, and education is what makes a man free." The Bureau helped start more than 4,300 schools, including 3 universities as known as Fisk's, Hampton, and Howard. White teachers arrived from the North to assist in the effort. "I feel that it is a precious privilege to be allowed to do something for the poor people," wrote one teacher. Former slaves flocked to the classrooms. Children learned to read and write, then went home and taught their parents. Young blacks trained to become teachers so that they could start their own schools. Education would become the Freedmen's Bureau's greatest accomplishment. Things fall apart. In July 1869, Congress closed the Freedmen's Bureau. The Bureau's education effort continued for 3 more years, but the end of Reconstruction was near. Reconstruction programs were expensive, and Southern opposition to them was bitter. In 1877, the newly elected U.S. President, Rutherford B. Hayes, pulled the last federal troops out of the South. Reconstruction was over. For Southern blacks, things went from bad to worse. The white terrorist group called the Ku Klux Klan tried to scare blacks and keep them from voting. White hooded Klan members rode through black communities at night, burning homes and churches and beating and murdering local residents. In 1868, the 14th Amendment guaranteed blacks and all the rights of U.S. citizens. But with the end of Reconstruction, Southern states began passing laws that enforced segregation, which is separation by race. You had segregation in schools, parks, and other public places. Laws even kept blacks from voting by requiring them to pay poll taxes and pass literacy tests, which were not required of whites. These would become known as Jim Crow laws after the minstrel or musical performer who was insulting to blacks. Mixed results. The Freedmen's Bureau enabled millions of people to survive, but it left millions of blacks dependent on their former owners to work and for security. In the words of one Mississippi freedman, the slaves expected a heap from freedom they didn't get.